Probably guessed from that compilation of my freaking adorable nephew just a moment ago, I have officially arrived in Florida. It has taken me a couple of weeks to sort of get organized and get my head on straight after the whirlwind month of July that included domestic travel, international travel, moving, all that jazz, but I'm finally sort of getting organized and getting my head on straight and getting back into regular booktubing. Today we are going to have a little discussion and talk about one of my favorite things, and that is book adaptations. Now, when I say book adaptations, the first thing you probably think of is book to movie adaptations, and we will of course be talking about book to movie adaptations. That is probably the type of adaptation I discuss most with people, particularly non-bookish friends of mine, because invariably a book will be adapted into a movie, and when people find out about it and think it's interesting and I tell them that it's based on a book and they should read the book, they go, I'd rather just watch the movie. It breaks my little bookish heart every time that happens, but it opens up some really interesting conversations. Now, contrary to popular belief amongst many of my non-bookish friends, I actually really love adaptations. I find it so fascinating to see the different ways that creators of different kinds of content can take a story that was originally produced in one particular format and rework it and adapt it to fit this new kind of format. Now, amongst the bookish community, we obviously talk much about adaptations and retellings, and I don't know if this is a generally accepted thing or just the way that I view it, but from my personal perspective, a retelling is when you take a story and you literally retell it in the same medium. So for example, if you're looking at something like the book Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, books like First and Then by Emma Mills or Eligible by Curtis Sittenfeld would be retellings of the Pride and Prejudice story, because they have taken the original story that was written in book format and retold it in a new, more modern way in book format again. An adaptation, however, is when you take a story that was originally produced in a particular format, be it web series or movie or book or play or whatever, and you adapt it for consumption in a new kind of way. So take a book and turn it into a movie, take a book and turn it into a play, take a movie and turn it into a Broadway musical. All of those are ways of adapting the original story. So again, looking at the Pride and Prejudice example, adaptations would be something like the BBC miniseries, which takes pretty much the original story almost word for word and puts it in front of your face in a film format, or something like the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, where it not only adapts it for a different format, specifically web video, but it also adapts the story into a more modern setting and therefore changes some of the different things that the characters deal with to fit the modern setting that they've placed the story into. Now, like I said, I don't dislike book adaptations. In fact, I rather enjoy them, and to be perfectly honest, two of my all-time favorite movies are actually adaptations of books. The thing that can make me love or hate an adaptation is whether or not that adaptation is done well, which of course begs the question, what makes an adaptation good? What makes it so that the adaptation has been done well? Now, there are a couple of different things that I think can sort of make or break an adaptation and make it really fantastic, or just something that you want to pretend does not exist. The first, the most important, is of course integrity to the story itself. Now, when I talk about integrity to the story itself, I'm not necessarily specifically talking about whether or not every single event from the book winds up in the play or the musical or the web series or whatever, because let's be honest, if you're talking about something like a movie adaptation, which generally most movies are somewhere between an hour and a half to 2.5 hours, usually right around the 2-hour mark, it's really difficult to fit an entire book in that span unless it's a pretty short book, without cutting at least something out. So I'm not specifically talking about keeping every single little detail of every single little scene in a story, because to be perfectly honest, sometimes that just is not possible. What I tend to look for instead when I talk about integrity to the story is the characters and the themes of the story that were presented by the author. And again, this does not mean that if they cut out a particular character that, I'm gonna say that they ruined the story, but depending on the story, sometimes cutting a specific character or how they wind up being portrayed based on the actor's decisions and the director's decisions, those can sort of make or break how you view a story. And that is one of the reasons that I'm a pretty staunch book before movie person, because I don't want my interpretations of the characters to be tainted or changed based on how they are portrayed by the actor and by the directorial choices. The other major thing that I look for when I'm thinking about the integrity of the story is how are the major themes that are discussed or reflected within the story, those sort of philosophical questions that an author wants you to ponder having read their book, how are those adapted? How are those reflected throughout the story? Is someone who sits down and watches the 2 or 2.5 hour movie willing to leave with those same kinds of questions that you as a reader did after finishing a 300 or 500 page book? And again, this is not to say that every single little nuanced theme has to be there in the story, but at the very least, the major overarching themes should be there and should be accurately reflected. If that's not the case, then it's not an accurate representation of the story that the author was trying to tell. That overarching thing, the integrity of the story is the biggest thing that I look for when it comes to whether or not I think an adaptation is good or not. The second big thing that I really look for when it comes to whether or not I think an adaptation is good is based on the chronology of the story, which goes back to what I was saying a little while ago about events being cut or characters being cut, that kind of thing. Like I said, every single tiny little event does not have to be within the story. My problem comes when you take major events or major plot points or major characters or those kinds of things and either combine them or change them in a way that is not necessary to fit the medium better. So for example, we'll look at something like The Hunger Games. The Hunger Games is written in first person, which means you spend the entirety of the series up in Katniss's head. It is pretty much impossible to make a movie from first person perspective unless you just have someone narrating over like 75% of the movie, which would be super boring. While you're reading the book, there are things that Katniss thinks about and she assumes are probably happening, but you don't actually know those because you only know what Katniss knows. When they made the film, they made some of those changes where they took the story from a first-person story to a third-person story, and while you do see all the things that Katniss is dealing with while she's in the arena, you also sort of pan out and see how Gale and her family is responding to what's happening, what President Snow is doing, what Seneca Crane and the rest of the Game Makers and all of that jazz are doing while this main thing is actually happening. That, I personally believe, is a fantastic example of taking something that works really well in book format, because a first-person book works really well, and taking it, putting it into a new medium, that is film, and adapting it so that it better fits the medium of film. My issue comes when that doesn't happen, and of course you probably know what I'm going to talk about, and this is the final battle in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2. I love the Harry Potter series, obviously, and Deathly Hallows is my favorite book in the series. I love it to pieces, and I absolutely adore that final battle scene in the book. It is fantastic, it is so well written, it climaxes the story in such an incredible way, and finally brings all these different threads together that J.K. Rowling has been weaving since the very beginning of the series 7 books ago, and it's just absolutely incredible. If you've seen Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2, you know that the film adaptation of the final battle between Harry and Voldemort is crap. It is terrible. It is the only film that I actually wound up seeing in theaters, and I was so angry. I was so excited to see that scene, and it was just terrible. Like, I look at that scene and I'm like, what? Why did the filmmaker, why did the director think that this was a better climax to this 8-movie, 7-book series than the incredible thing that J.K. Rowling wrote? More than anything, that is my biggest adaptation pet peeve. Whether you're talking about a play or a web series or a movie or something like that, when you take an element of the story, particularly a huge element like the final battle between Harry and Voldemort, and you change it without needing to. I understand when things have to be cut for time or for clarity's sake when you're switching mediums, but when you could take exactly what the author wrote and put it into the film or the web series or the play or whatever, adapted exactly as it was written, and it's not going to affect the time or the understanding for the audience, why would you change that? It just does not make any sense to me. And the reason for that is because I think when you're adapting any story, whether you're taking a movie into a Broadway show or a book into a web series or whatever format the original story was produced in, whether it was a book or a play or a movie, that is how the creator of that story originally intended for it to be consumed in. Not to say that they're not opposed to it becoming a movie or whatever, because obviously they had to sign off the rights for it to be adapted, but when they wrote the story, that's how they intended for people to come at the story. Suzanne Collins intended for you to be up in Katniss's head for the entirety of the Hunger Games. J.K. Rowling intended for the Harry Potter story to end in that very specific way. And when you take things like that and you change them just on a whim, that is where I take issue with book adaptations. Those are all my thoughts on book adaptations for today. I would love to hear any of your thoughts, whether or not you are a big book adaptation fan, if you have similar things that sort of make or break a book adaptation for you. Please get some discussion going down in the comments. I would love to chat with you guys about this. And I'm also very excited to announce that I am starting a new series specifically on adaptations. Like I said, adaptations are some of my favorite things. I really love seeing how different stories are adapted, and so I'm going to be doing a video maybe once every month or every 2 months where I talk about my favorite adaptations of a particular story, or maybe my favorite adaptations of a particular author, or, you know, my favorite adaptations on a particular subject, just any of those things. And this may mean that as new book to movie adaptations come out, I may do some, you know, comparison reviews and the like once I have seen the film adaptations. So if you have suggestions or particular books or movies or other adaptations that you would like to hear my thoughts on, please let me know in the comments and I will get to those soon. If you want to follow me elsewhere online, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Goodreads, all at Sarah Ann Hayes. The link for those profiles will be in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe and I will see you next time. Bye!